Terry Bradshaw is one of the most familiar and powerful figures in American sports history. His name is tied tightly to the golden era of the Pittsburgh Steelers, with 4 Super Bowl championships that an entire generation of Americans grew up with. On the field, Bradshaw embodied everything America celebrates: strength, courage, the ability to handle pressure, and winning when all eyes were on him. He was the quarterback who led in the biggest games, the one who stood firm amid the fiercest collisions, the face on magazine covers, TV shows, and NFL history books. Those silver trophies, those game-winning throws, those roaring crowds turned him into a symbol of absolute success. To millions of Americans, Terry Bradshaw was living proof that glory could be achieved through will and talent, that the American sports dream was real, that some people are born to win and have their names etched in history without hesitation. But that's only half the story, the half America saw and believed in. The other half began when the stadium lights went out, when the applause faded, when the door closed and no one was left to witness. In that silence, Terry Bradshaw lived with a pain that no victory could soothe, a feeling of emptiness, doubt and fear that stretched across decades. Behind the hero image was a man who always wondered if he truly deserved everything he had, or if he was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. He carried constant anxiety, unnamed depression, and the pressure to keep appearing strong in a culture where men aren't allowed to be weak. Terry Bradshaw had to live 2 parallel lives, one shining in public where he couldn't afford to make mistakes, and one hidden in the shadows where he had to face his relentless self-doubt alone. What kept him standing wasn't confidence, it was sheer survival will, the will to step back into the light every day, to keep smiling, to keep fulfilling the role of an icon, even as inside he was a man learning to coexist with his own fears. And it's precisely at that intersection of glory and suffering that the real story of Terry Bradshaw begins. If you want to keep exploring the real stories behind the glory that history often overlooks, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this journey. Terry Bradshaw wasn't born into the spotlight, nor did he grow up with gentle encouragement or emotional protection. His childhood was tied to the harsh American South, where blazing sun, sweat, and discipline were the measures of a person's worth, and where a boy was taught that men aren't allowed to be weak. In that environment, emotions weren't something to share, they were something to swallow. Fear wasn't named, tears weren't allowed to fall, and any sign of fragility was seen as failure. Terry grew up surrounded by silent but brutal messages: if you're not tough enough, you'll be left behind. If you don't win, you have no place. But what haunted him most deeply wasn't the fear of losing, it was the fear of being seen as stupid, not smart enough, not worthy of respect in a world that always demanded men be strong, both physically and mentally. From very early on, Terry carried the feeling that he had to try twice as hard as everyone else, just to stand on equal ground. Every test, every comment, every glance became an invisible trial, where he judged himself. Instead of being encouraged, he learned to doubt himself. Instead of being reassured, he learned to push himself forward, even while trembling inside. That self-destructive mechanism formed quietly, over trying to hide insecurity, working to exhaustion to prove his worth, and never allowing himself to pause and breathe. Terry didn't learn to believe in himself, he learned to live in a constant state of defense, as if slowing down even one beat would let everyone see he wasn't as good as they thought. Terry Bradshaw's psychological tragedy therefore didn't start with football plays or stadium pressure. It started in those very early years, when a boy understood that love and acceptance had to be earned through performance. He carried that fear through his teenage years, turning it into drive but also into a burden. Every small failure was magnified into proof he wasn't good enough. Every success brought no real peace, only prolonged worry. What if I collapse next time? In silence, Terry learned to smile in front of others, but torment himself when alone. He didn't seek pity, he just tried to survive in a world that didn't allow men to admit they were hurting. That's why when football entered Terry Bradshaw's life, it wasn't just a sport. It was the only place he believed he could prove his worth without having to explain his feelings. But even before he ever held that first football, the tragedy had already taken root quietly. A person taught that if he wasn't perfect, he wouldn't be loved. Terry's will was forged from fear, not from confidence, and the most painful irony is that what pushed him forward was also what followed him his whole life like a shadow, the obsession that if he ever weakened even once, everything would collapse. That part of his life, where the tragedy began before the glory, shaped the man later celebrated by all of America, but rarely truly understood. The moment Terry Bradshaw's name was called as the #1 pick in the NFL draft wasn't just the start of a career, it was the moment a silent curse was placed on the shoulders of a young man who hadn't yet grasped the full cost of being expected to succeed. To America, the #1 pick meant glory, absolute belief, a future promised in glowing headlines. To Terry, it felt like stepping onto the witness stand before he'd even had a chance to speak in his own defense. The media hailed him as a savior, as the one born to change a team's destiny, but right in those praises lay the cruel trap. From that moment on, every mistake of his would no longer be the mistake of a young player, it would be public evidence of the failure of a decision of national scale. Terry entered the NFL, not with the mindset of someone given an opportunity, but with the feeling of someone carrying a suspended sentence over his head. Every practice, every throw, every play read came with a chillingly clear obsession: if I fail, the whole country will see. If I'm off by one beat, millions of eyes will turn away. If I don't live up to the image they've drawn of me, I'll become a joke. Being draft #1 didn't give him time to learn quietly, didn't allow him to grow through private mistakes. He was thrown straight into the center of the spotlight, where every step was magnified, where inexperience was interpreted as weakness, and where fear wasn't allowed to exist. That pressure didn't come as one single blow, it came as a constant underground stream rising higher and higher. The press wrote about him before he could prove anything, analyzing him as a finished product, instead of a human still learning to adapt. Initial praise quickly turned into harsh comparisons, relentless questions about whether he deserved the #1 spot. Terry felt very clearly that the public's love was conditional, and that condition was written in invisible ink: win immediately. In his mind, every game wasn't just a game, it was a new trial, where judgment was delivered without debate. Fear gradually became his constant companion. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it clung to him in the quietest moments. Terry began living in a state of perpetual alertness, as if relaxing for even a second would let everything slip away. He tried harder than necessary, practiced to exhaustion, forced himself to be perfect in an environment that showed no mercy for imperfection. But the bitter paradox was that the harder he tried to deserve the #1 spot, the more he felt he was standing on shaky ground. Every compliment brought no reassurance, only extended the fear that next time he might lose it all. Draft #1 turned Terry Bradshaw into an icon before he could even become himself. It locked him into an image he had to protect at all costs, even if the cost was his inner peace. He didn't enter the NFL with the excitement of a dream come true. He entered with the mindset of someone who understood that from now on, every failure would be remembered longer than every success. That pressure didn't just test his body or talent, it wore away layer by layer the fragile self-belief he'd struggled to build since childhood. And in silence, Terry began to realize a painful truth: being chosen first wasn't a reward, it was a burden not everyone was prepared to carry. When Terry Bradshaw officially put on the black and gold of the Pittsburgh Steelers, he didn't step into a city that was merely a workplace. He stepped into a community with long memories, harsh expectations, and very little patience for inexperience. Pittsburgh was the city of steel, of hard labor, of people accustomed to enduring, and also to judging. There no one spent much time waiting for a young quarterback to grow up. They wanted results, immediately. And Terry, carrying all the insecurities from his childhood, and the weight of being draft #1 on his shoulders, was thrown straight into that merciless crucible before he could even steady himself. His first few seasons weren't a fairy tale. They were a string of mistakes, errant passes, interceptions that silenced the stadium, then erupted in disappointment. Every game ended not just with a score, but with another scar in his mind, where doubt increasingly took the place of belief. The Pittsburgh press showed no mercy. Cold headlines appeared regularly, turning Terry from a beacon of hope into a symbol of disappointment. He was called the draft disaster, proof of a bad decision, a burden the team had to carry on its back. In analyses, his name was dissected like a public failure case, where every error was magnified and repeated until there was no room left for sympathy. Terry read those articles not because he wanted to, but because he needed to know what people were saying about him, needed to brace himself for the next cold stares. Every word felt like confirmation of his deepest fear that he wasn't good enough, that that #1 spot was just a massive mistake witnessed by the whole country. But the most painful part didn't come from the pages of the papers, it came from the stands. Right at home, where there should have been a pillar of support, Terry heard the boos directed straight at him. Every time he stepped out to the huddle, he knew that just one more mistake and that sound would rain down like hail. The fans who were supposed to have his back became a mirror reflecting his greatest fear, being publicly hated. There was no place to hide, no way to explain. He couldn't step up to the podium and say he was trying, that he was learning, that fear was eroding every decision. He could only bow his head, strap on his helmet, and keep walking out onto the field as if nothing had happened. In that context, Terry learned a brutal lesson. Endure the humiliation in silence. He learned to swallow every reaction inside, not to argue with the press, not to react to the crowd, not to let himself show the hurt. Every boo was stored away somewhere very deep, not processed, not released, just piling up on top of each other. He started to believe that speaking up would only make things worse, that the only way to survive was to be tough on the outside, even as he was shattering inside. Terry didn't cry in public, he didn't complain, but that didn't mean he didn't hurt. On the contrary, that silence made the pain root deeper, gnawing into every thought, every decision, every moment of self-questioning when he was alone. The feeling of being hated didn't stop at the stadium. It seeped into his everyday life, turning every practice into a psychological battle. Terry stepped onto the practice field feeling like he had to prove his worth all over again every day, as if yesterday never existed. One good throw wasn't enough to erase the memory of the bad one before it. One solid game wasn't enough to wipe away the disaster label that had stuck to him. He lived in a state of constant surveillance, constant judgment, and gradually, he started monitoring himself more harshly than anyone else. Every small mistake became self-incriminating evidence. Every success was just a brief delay before the next verdict. Pittsburgh, in those years, didn't give Terry Bradshaw time to grow up normally. That city demanded he mature immediately, be strong immediately, prove himself worthy immediately. And when he couldn't meet those unrealistic demands, the reaction was a cold turn of the back. That left a deep psychological scar, the sense that love and support were conditional, that one slip and you'd be left behind. Terry wasn't just battling opposing defenses, he was fighting a merciless social atmosphere where every mistake was treated like a final sentence. It was right in this phase that part of Terry's self started to close off. He stopped expecting to be understood. He stopped seeking empathy. Instead, he built a thicker, harder shell to shield himself from the invisible but constant attacks. But that shell didn't heal, it just helped him endure. And the cost of that endurance was a growing sense of isolation, the feeling that he was standing alone in a crowded city, with no one truly on his side. Pittsburgh didn't give Terry Bradshaw the chance to make mistakes like a young man. It forced him to pay for every tentative step, and in that process, it broke a part of the fragile trust he'd carried for so long. Before he could even mature, before he could even understand himself, Terry learned that to survive, he had to accept being hated without the right to speak up. And it was from that silence full of humiliation that a deep psychological wound began to form, following him for the rest of his life. After those turbulent early seasons, when the boos in the stands hadn't even had time to die down, Terry Bradshaw stepped into the Pittsburgh Steelers locker room with a feeling that was becoming all too familiar: isolation. The locker room was supposed to be the last refuge for players, where they could shed their public armor, share fears, exhaustion, and seek a word of encouragement to keep getting back up. But for Terry, that room was as cold as an echoing hallway. Power in the locker room existed in a strict hierarchy, and at the center of that hierarchy was Chuck Noll, a disciplined, quiet man who believed in structure, in silence, in letting results speak for themselves. In that philosophy, there was no room for coddling, no space for acknowledging fear, and certainly no place for a young quarterback reeling mentally to seek comfort. The relationship between Terry and Chuck Noll wasn't a loud conflict, nor open hostility. It was more dangerous in its way: prolonged coldness, No private talks to reassure, no words of encouragement after a bad game, no signals to let Terry know he was still trusted even in failure. That silence, in an already harsh environment, became a kind of unspoken message: endure it yourself, or get cut. Terry stood in the middle of the locker room, surrounded by teammates, but felt like he was in a space no one could truly reach him. He didn't know who to turn to, and say he was scared, that every time he took the ball it was a battle with the racing thoughts in his head. He just knew no one was waiting for an explanation, and no one wanted to hear about fragility. That isolation seeped into how Terry saw himself. He started to believe every relationship in football was conditional, and that condition was winning. No wins, no protection. No wins, no sympathy. Even as the team started to find its rhythm, even as the first victories appeared, Terry still didn't feel safe, because he'd learned that the silence of authority could turn its back at any moment. One bad game, one string of mistakes, and everything would snap back: the cold stares, the invisible distance, and the sense of standing alone against the whole system. In that locker room, Terry learned to suppress himself even more. He didn't seek validation from the coach. He didn't expect a pat on the back, or a word of encouragement. Instead, he built a dangerous habit, carrying it all alone. Every fear was pushed inside, every doubt locked away, every failure handled in absolute silence. He started to believe that if he showed weakness, it would be seen as a sign of not fitting in, and in an environment where everything was measured by performance, not fitting in meant getting replaced. The feeling of having nowhere to vent his fears made Terry more and more closed off. He laughed less in the locker room, spoke less in meetings, and spent more time alone dissecting every small mistake. Chuck Noll's silence, though not intended to hurt, became a mirror reflecting Terry's deepest worry, that he was just a tool, and his value only existed as long as he was useful. Even when wins came, Terry didn't dare relax. He didn't celebrate with relief, but with vigilance, as if victory was just a short pause before the next judgment. Gradually, a distorted belief formed in his mind: even wins didn't protect him. If wins didn't bring safety, then failure would surely bring punishment. That belief kept Terry living in prolonged tension, where every game was a survival test rather than joy. He didn't step onto the field to enjoy football. He stepped out to avoid being eliminated. The locker room, instead of a place to recover, became a place that reinforced the fear, where he reminded himself there was no room for mistakes, no room for emotions, and no one to lean on when everything collapsed. In the silence of authority and discipline, Terry Bradshaw gradually lost something more important than confidence: the sense of belonging. He was in the team, but didn't feel fully embraced. He won with the collective, but bore the fear alone. And that isolation shaped a painful paradox: a quarterback leading the whole team, but with no one leading him out of the maze of inner doubts. The locker room without comfort became the backdrop where Terry learned to survive without protection, a lesson that helped him stand firm under pressure, but also left silent wounds that no victory, no matter how brilliant, could erase. When Terry Bradshaw led the Pittsburgh Steelers to the pinnacle of 4 Super Bowl wins in a short span of NFL history, the outside world saw a story so perfect, it was almost unrepeatable. Victory after victory, title after title, a quarterback at the center of a dynasty, etched into legend while still playing. Those glory nights flooded with lights, those moments of lifting the silver trophy amid a sea of roaring people, those praises calling him MVP, icon, the one who fulfilled the ultimate American football dream. On paper, it was an achievement a player might never touch in a lifetime. In collective memory, it was an undisputed peak, but it was right there, where most stories wrap up in fulfillment, that Terry stepped into a deeper and colder void than any failure he'd ever tasted. After every win, when the crowds dispersed, and the celebration music faded, Terry faced a truth that scared him more than the fiercest blitzes. He didn't feel happy, not the bursting joy, not the liberating relief, but a thick silence that settled in right as everything ended. He returned to the locker room, to the hotel, to the closed-door room, and realized there was no sense of triumph in his chest that people always talked about. Instead, there was a vague worry, an unnamed tension, as if the success just now only made him prepare more for the next judgment. Terry started losing sleep. Long nights dragged on. When his body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't quiet, replaying every play, every decision, every moment that could have gone wrong. He lay there in the silence, wondering why he couldn't enjoy what all of America believed was the end point of happiness. Depression, at first just fleeting spells of mental fatigue, gradually grew heavier after each season. Instead of feeling protected by victory, Terry felt more exposed. Each new title didn't reinforce his belief, it brought a new fear: if I'm the champion today, tomorrow I could become the one who disappoints. The lingering anxiety clung to him in every quiet moment, making celebrations feel forced, turning congratulations into reminders that the standard had been raised to a level where no mistakes were allowed. He began to feel ashamed of his own reactions, ashamed for not being happy when he was supposed to be happy, ashamed for not knowing who to tell that he felt empty, ashamed for fearing that if this truth came out, people would think he was ungrateful for the glory so many dreamed of. In those peak years, Terry lived with a painful paradox. The brighter the external success, the deeper the inner darkness. He smiled for the cameras, answered interviews in the tone of a winner, but when he turned away, the heaviness flooded back. No celebration ritual could dispel the unease lodged in his chest. No trophy was strong enough to make him believe he was safe. Terry began to realize that winning didn't bring rest, it only extended the endless race against himself. He didn't dare relax, because relaxing meant losing control, and losing control was something he'd been taught from childhood was never allowed to happen. The pressure of history, the label of legend, and the ever-rising expectations formed an invisible wall closing in around him. Terry couldn't share that feeling with teammates, because in locker room culture, winning was the cure for every pain. He couldn't share it with the public, because heroes aren't allowed to say they're lost, so he kept it all inside, letting depression quietly take root, letting anxiety become the background noise of his life. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see moments of glory, he saw the worst-case scenarios that could happen, as if his mind was already preparing for the inevitable collapse. What made this tragedy even more bitter was the self-blame. Terry didn't just suffer from not being happy, he blamed himself for it. He wondered if something was broken in him, if he was missing something others had, if he didn't know how to appreciate what he'd achieved. That shame made him close off even more, made him more determined to maintain the strong outer image to hide the cracks inside. And in that process, he gradually came to believe something dangerous, that his emotions were wrong, that his pain wasn't valid, that his only task was to keep winning and stay silent. The 4 Super Bowl trophies, seen from afar, were proof of a perfect career, but for Terry Bradshaw, they were also markers of how much deeper he sank into a silent region no one could see. The peak turned into an abyss not because of failure, but because success didn't deliver what he needed most: peace. He stood at the top of the world, but found no place to stand firm in his own soul. And there, between glory and silence, a quiet tragedy played out for years. A man who won everything, but couldn't allow himself to feel happy, and carried that unnamed shame like a burden heavier than any trophy he ever lifted. After seasons of back-to-back glory, after 4 Super Bowl trophies and titles etched deep into history, Terry Bradshaw's life didn't become any lighter. On the contrary, it began to split into 2 parallel streams, drifting farther apart, harder and harder to reconnect. On the field, Terry was still the familiar American hero, strong, decisive, standing tall under pressure, leading a winning team. He put on the uniform, strapped on the helmet, stepped out in front of tens of thousands of eyes, and performed the role the whole country expected. But when night fell, when the door closed and all the noise faded, another Terry emerged, a man broken down, exhausted, empty, facing thoughts that refused to quiet. Those 2 people existed side by side in the same body, and with each passing day, the gap between them widened. To keep stepping into the light, Terry had to rely on things he never thought he'd need. Antidepressants became a silent part of his life, never mentioned, never publicly acknowledged, but necessary so he could wake up, practice, play, and smile for the cameras. He took the pills not to find happiness, but to keep himself from completely falling apart. In the world of American football, where masculinity is measured by endurance and victory, Having to rely on medication was something hard to accept, even shameful. So Terry kept it to himself, like a life-or-death secret. Each pill didn't just help him control the anxiety, it reminded him that if this truth ever came out, the hero image could shatter in the public's eyes. Emotional isolation became his only protective barrier. Terry didn't allow himself to speak about what was happening inside, because he believed that once the words escaped, they couldn't be taken back. He feared being looked at differently, feared being judged as weak, feared that all his past wins would be diminished just because he didn't fit the steelman mold American sports worshipped. So he kept playing the strong role, kept joking for the cameras, kept shouldering the pressure, as if nothing could touch him. But the truth was, every time he did that, the burden grew heavier. The double life was no longer just about hiding, it became a survival structure, an invisible prison where stepping out meant, he believed, losing everything. By day Terry had to stay sharp, alert, never allowed to hesitate. By night his mind spun relentlessly, sleepless nights stretched on, thoughts repeating over and over about whether tomorrow he'd be found out, whether one small mistake would be enough to expose everything. He lived in constant tension, like an actor who could never forget his lines, because one moment of slip-up, and the role would collapse. That fear didn't just point outward, it turned inward and gnawed at him. Terry began to doubt even the moments when he felt temporarily okay, as if peace was only fleeting and untrustworthy. The cruelest part of the double life was that it forced Terry to deny himself. He didn't just hide from others, he hid from himself the real emotions. Every time he felt weak, he reminded himself it wasn't allowed. Every time anxiety rose, he pushed it down deeper. But buried emotions don't disappear, they build up, growing heavier and more persistent. Terry began to feel like he was living two lives that never met, one public, where he was loved for his strength, and one private, where he didn't dare believe he deserved that love. That split exhausted him not physically, but mentally. Over time, the double life hardened into a shell he couldn't remove. It shaped how Terry thought, reacted, and existed. He no longer clearly remembered what it felt like to live without being on guard. Even in the rare quiet moments, his mind stayed in ready position, as if an invisible threat was always lurking. The fear of being discovered became the hidden drive behind every action. He had to keep being strong, keep succeeding, keep playing the hero, because stopping would let everything he'd hidden for years flood into the light. The double life, once a temporary solution, had become a prison. It gave Terry the ability to survive in a world that didn't allow him to be weak, but at the same time stripped away the chance to live fully as a human being. He no longer clearly distinguished where the real self ended, and the image he had to maintain began. Each passing day was a day he had to strain to keep those two people from colliding, and it was in that straining that Terry Bradshaw gradually realized a bitter truth: to keep surviving in the spotlight, he had to accept carrying fear as an inseparable part of his life. The double life wasn't just a secret, it was the price he had to pay to continue existing in the role America had given him, a price so heavy that sometimes he didn't know if he was living for the wins, or just living to keep from being exposed as the fragile human being behind them. By the time Terry Bradshaw had grown accustomed to living two parallel lives, football, the thing that once gave him a reason to exist, began to turn its back in the cruelest way. The elbow injury didn't come like a thunderbolt, it came as a slow, silent, irreversible drain. Every throw was a betrayal of will by his body, every practice a reminder that what had defined him was leaving. For a quarterback, the arm isn't just a tool, it's identity. And when that arm no longer obeyed, Terry understood he was facing what he'd feared more than failure his whole life: the end. Not an end in controlled glory, but a sudden, non-negotiable end, with no time to prepare. Football, after giving him everything, now took it all back with cold finality. When the decision that he could no longer play became reality, Terry didn't just lose a career, he lost the structure that had kept him upright for years. No more practice schedules, no more locker room, no more huddle calls, no more moments stepping onto the field with the fragile but familiar feeling that he knew what to do. The field, once both battlefield and refuge, vanished from his life in an instant, and with it the only role he knew how to fill disappeared too. Terry was no longer a quarterback, and when the question "who am I" no longer had an answer tied to football, the void appeared raw and more terrifying than any pressure he'd ever faced. In that void, there were no longer two Terrys to split the burden, only one man left facing himself directly, with no stage to hide on, no role to cling to. Depression, which before had been kept manageable by the rhythm of competition and iron discipline, now showed its full face. It was no longer masked by cheers or weekend goals. It appeared in the mornings with no reason to rush, in the evenings with no game to prepare for, and in the long silences where Terry didn't know where to put himself. He was no longer fighting opponents on the field. He was fighting the racing thoughts in his head, the feeling that his core value had been stripped away. The abrupt end of his career made Terry feel like he'd been pushed to the sidelines of his own life story. The man who was once cheered now stood outside the lights, watching the world of football keep moving without him. That created a pain hard to name, the feeling of being replaced, not by one specific person, but by the very flow of the game itself. The NFL doesn't stop to mourn anyone. It moves on, and Terry, for the first time in his adult life, no longer had a clear place in it. That truth hit him harder than any tackle. Turns out he could be left behind, and the world would still be fine. With no role left to cling to, Terry was forced to face the rawest version of himself, the version unprotected by titles or history. The defense mechanisms that once helped him survive the double life no longer worked. There was no reason left to pretend to be strong, but also no tools to truly be vulnerable. He stood in the emptiness, where there were no more roaring crowds, and no words of comfort. Depression was no longer something he could hide behind achievements. It became his daily reality, a quiet pull that made every morning feel heavier than the one before. Terry began to understand that leaving the field wasn't just a career change, it was losing the only language he'd ever used to connect with the world. The silence after retirement was different from the silence after victory. It didn't carry anticipation, it carried abandonment. Terry heard the clock ticking, heard his own breathing, and heard the question repeating without an answer: if I'm no longer the one they need, then who am I? Depression, now unchallenged by any goals, took over his entire mental space. It distorted memories, making even the old wins feel distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Terry didn't feel proud. He felt detached, like he was looking back at his life from the outside. Football had given Terry Bradshaw an escape from childhood fears, a structure to survive in, and a role society recognized. But when the game took it all back, it left him facing what he'd spent his life trying to avoid, a self not defined by winning. The elbow injury didn't just end a career, it tore open the last protective shell, forcing Terry into the most dangerous phase of his life, the phase with no place left to hide. And it was in that cold emptiness, with no field, no role, only depression in its raw form, that Terry Bradshaw began to understand the greatest challenge wasn't winning another Super Bowl. It was learning how to exist when no trophy stood between him and his deepest fears. When Terry Bradshaw stepped away from the field and faced the nameless void of post-football life, the cracks once hidden by practice schedules, playbooks, and game pressure began to spread into the most private area: marriage. There were no sensational stories, no violence, no scandals making headlines, just prolonged coldness, silent distances, and the feeling of being far apart even when sitting side by side. Terry entered his marriages, hoping to find the peace football had never given him, but he brought along an unhealed man who didn't understand himself, and therefore didn't know how to give what he didn't have. In family life, Terry wasn't cruel or irresponsible. He showed up, he tried, he wanted to do right, but that presence often lacked connection. Depression made him withdraw, anxiety made him defensive, and the habit of suppressing emotions, the thing that once helped him survive in the locker room, became a wall separating him from the person next to him. Terry didn't know how to say what he was afraid of, didn't know where to start explaining the lingering emptiness. Instead of sharing, he stayed silent. Instead of opening up, he pulled inward, And over time, silence became the only language his relationships understood. The marriages didn't break in loud arguments. They faded in quiet erosion. Each passing day widened the gap a little more, until both sides realized they were living with someone, but no longer reaching each other. Terry, already accustomed to feeling replaced after retirement, now faced another pain. The sense that he couldn't hold on to the people he loved most. This wasn't just emotional loss. It struck straight at the fragile belief that he could do something well outside of football. Each breakup wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was a bitter reminder that maybe the problem was him. Terry began looking at himself with harsher eyes. He wondered if he really knew how to love, or if he only knew how to try to fill the roles society expected. He'd learned how to be a hero, a winner, a man who couldn't afford to be weak, but he'd never learned how to be a man who could sit with his fears and share them with someone else. In marriage, where vulnerability isn't just allowed but necessary, Terry felt lost. He feared that if he revealed the dark corners inside, he'd be left, and that very fear pushed him further into self-isolation, making the leaving inevitable. Each collapse deepened the sense of failure, because this time there was no external factor to blame, not an opposing defense, not the media, not an injury, just one raw truth. Terry Bradshaw couldn't love fully while he himself was still breaking apart. That made the depression root even deeper, reinforcing a dangerous belief that he wasn't good enough to be kept, that even off the field he couldn't hold his role. The shame returned, not loud but persistent, making him reluctant to seek help and even more closed off in his inner world. In the rare moments of honesty with himself, Terry realized he'd carried the same survival strategy from football into marriage: endure in silence. But in love, enduring doesn't build connection, it builds distance. The women who entered his life didn't leave because of a lack of affection. They left because they couldn't reach a man who always stood behind an invisible wall. Terry wasn't lacking in kindness, but he lacked the language to express it. And when that language doesn't exist, relationships slowly drain away, even when no one wants to hurt anyone. The broken marriages left Terry with a painful lesson he wasn't ready to accept. Winning doesn't teach a person how to love, and discipline doesn't replace understanding. He'd spent his life learning how not to fall under pressure, but he'd never been taught how to sit with fear without running from it. Each separation was a mirror, reflecting a man trying to find peace on the outside while the storm inside hadn't settled. And it was at that point that Terry Bradshaw's tragedy became clearer than ever. A man who once led an entire team, but didn't know how to lead himself in the relationships that required the most gentleness and honesty. This part of life had no loud climax, only lingering echoes. Terry walked out of each marriage with less noise, but more doubt. He didn't resent, didn't blame, he just carried the feeling that he'd failed where it should have been the safest. And that feeling, quiet but heavy, followed him into the next chapter, where he'd be forced to find a different way to exist, one not based on winning or playing a role, but on learning to face the unhealed version of himself. After the quiet breakdowns of his personal life, when Terry Bradshaw had left the field and carried a hard-to-name sense of failure, he stepped into a new space that seemed gentler: television. His appearance on Fox NFL Sunday opened another chapter, where Terry no longer had to throw passes or absorb brutal hits. He just had to talk, smile, and be himself on camera. On screen he was the picture of ease, self-deprecating, laughing loudly at his own stories, willing to turn both his glorious past and his mistakes into jokes. Viewers saw a friendly, approachable Terry Bradshaw, a man unafraid to poke fun at himself, seemingly free from the pressure of always being the hero. But behind that regular burst of laughter was a truth few noticed. Humor wasn't joy, it was armor. Terry quickly learned that in the world of television, laughter had special power. It closed distances, softened heavy memories, and made others feel comfortable around you. He used it naturally, turning self-mockery into a brand, turning old failures into entertainment material. But deep down, the humor didn't come from relief, it came from the need to survive. After years of living in fear of judgment and rejection, Terry realized that if he laughed first, others would find it harder to hurt him. Laughter became a way to control the narrative, to keep the upper hand in a world that had taken it from him many times before. Every time Terry joked about himself on air, it wasn't just confidence, it was a sophisticated defense strategy. He covered the cracks with outward ease, masked the emptiness with hearty laughs. Viewers didn't see the sleepless nights still there, didn't see the simmering anxiety that never fully went away. They saw a man who seemed to have overcome it all, found joy again, moved into a lighter phase of life. And that very contrast pushed Terry's double life into a new form, no longer the hero on the field and the broken man in the shadows, but the joker in front of the public and the tired man behind the scenes. In the environment of Fox NFL Sunday, Terry was loved not for perfection, but for his relatability. That gave him a temporary sense of safety, a kind of acceptance he'd once lacked in those early years in Pittsburgh. But that acceptance still came with conditions. As long as he kept bringing the laughs, so he kept laughing, kept joking, kept lightening the mood, even when inside he wasn't light at all. Humor became a habit, then an instinct. He was no longer sure whether he was laughing because he was happy, or because he was afraid that if he stopped laughing, people would see what he'd tried to hide for so many years. The mental exhaustion didn't disappear just because the setting changed. It just took on a different, more discreet, harder to spot form. Terry could stand in the middle of the studio set, laughing loudly with his colleagues, but when the cameras turned off, the emptiness came rushing back. No more field to vent pressure on, no more specific opponents to beat, just a vague feeling that he was existing by making other people feel comfortable. That wasn't like joy, it was like a task. And that task, even though gentler than the old hits and tackles, still drained his mental energy in a quiet way. Humor, in Terry Bradshaw's case, wasn't liberation, it was postponement. It helped him avoid directly facing questions that had no answers, helped him keep a safe distance from unnamed pain. But for that very reason, it prolonged the half-lived state, where he still hadn't truly reached healing. Terry was no longer hated like in the early years of his career, but he still hadn't dared believe he could be loved without having to play the fun guy. The armor of laughter protected him from outside blows, but at the same time kept him from fully feeling what was happening inside. In this phase of his life, Terry Bradshaw was no longer fighting to win, he was fighting to keep everything from falling apart. Humor became a way to survive, not joy. It allowed him to keep showing up, keep being accepted, keep existing in the public eye, without having to pry open the deep hidden cracks. But like every other armor, it had weight. And over time, Terry began to feel that weight, began to feel that always having to laugh came with its own cost. The laughter rang out regularly on television, but somewhere behind it, a man was still learning how to breathe in silence, waiting for the day he felt safe enough to take off the armor and face himself without needing to joke to survive. At some point, the armor of laughter began to crack, not because Terry Bradshaw grew weaker, but because the burden of hiding had finally exceeded what one human could carry. After years of living on self-deprecation, on the ability to make others feel at ease, Terry stood before a decision he'd spent his life avoiding, saying out loud what no one expected to hear from an American sports icon, saying he had depression, saying he'd been on medication for years just to keep going, saying that behind the laughter were sleepless nights, prolonged anxiety, and a nameless fear that had never left. That wasn't a spontaneous confession, it was the result of decades of suppression, of near collapses he'd still forced himself to stand through, of exhaustion from constantly proving he was okay. When Terry went public with his depression, he knew he was stepping into the most dangerous moment of his life, not because of the media, not because of public reaction, but because he was forced to face himself head-on. In the NFL culture he grew up in, masculinity was built on toughness, endurance, and silence. Men don't complain, heroes don't talk about fear, and a quarterback who won 4 Super Bowls was even less allowed to admit he'd been battling mental illness for years. Terry understood very clearly what could happen: doubt, whispers, even being seen as having gone soft in the eyes of those who once worshipped his strong image. But precisely because he understood that, the decision to speak carried the weight of a turning point. Admitting he'd been on medication for years was another shock, not because of the medication itself, but because of its symbolic meaning. For Terry, each pill had once been a life-or-death secret, something that let him keep stepping into the light, but also reminded him he wasn't the image people expected. When he said it out loud, He wasn't just talking about a treatment process, he was breaking a mold. He asked a blunt question at the heart of American sports culture: what happens when the winner can no longer carry the invincible image? Terry wasn't seeking pity, he wasn't asking to be understood, he was just telling the truth, a simple but terrifying truth, that winning doesn't make a person immune to mental illness, and silence isn't strength. That moment didn't look like a rousing speech. It looked like raw exhaustion. Terry spoke slowly, spoke plainly, and spoke in a voice that no longer needed to prove anything. He admitted there were days he didn't want to get out of bed, that there were periods when life became so heavy that even laughter couldn't save him. And most importantly, he admitted he'd once been ashamed of it, ashamed for not feeling happy when he had everything, ashamed for having to rely on medication to keep going, ashamed for fearing this truth would overshadow what he'd achieved. When he said those things, Terry wasn't just telling his own story, he was touching the collective fear of so many men raised in the same value system. The public reaction wasn't entirely what Terry had feared. There was surprise, there was confusion, but there was also a wave of quiet relief. Many people saw an icon say something they'd never dared say themselves for the first time. Terry's vulnerability didn't make him smaller, it made his image more real, but that didn't make the moment any less dangerous for him personally. Because once the truth was spoken, there was no going back. Terry could no longer return to being the guy who just laughed to hide. He had to live with his words, had to look straight into the inner room he'd always kept locked. Facing himself in front of the public was a different challenge from enduring in silence. Silence allowed avoidance. Speaking forced him to stay with what he'd admitted. Terry had to learn to exist without fully relying on the armor of humor, had to learn to accept that there were days he wasn't okay, and that didn't make him less valuable. This wasn't an instant healing moment. It didn't erase the depression, it didn't make the anxiety disappear, but it changed his relationship with his pain. For the first time, he didn't see it as an enemy to hide, he saw it as a part of reality that needed to be managed and understood. The climax of Terry Bradshaw's inner tragedy wasn't in tears or public collapse. It was in the rare courage of a man who'd spent his whole life maintaining a strong image, deciding to say he wasn't okay. That decision didn't bring immediate peace, but it opened a different path, a path where he no longer had to live two completely separate lives. By saying the unsayable, Terry traded the safety of silence for the chance to live more truthfully, even if more fragilely. And it was in that dangerous moment, with no protection left except honesty, that Terry Bradshaw stepped into the hardest but most necessary phase, learning to exist without pretending, learning to stand before the public, not as an untouchable icon, but as a human who'd walked through darkness and dared to name it. After daring to say the unsayable, after the final armor of silence was finally removed, Terry Bradshaw faced another truth even more cruel: the body forgets nothing. The years of silent endurance, the prolonged periods of tension, the sleepless nights, the anxiety compressed beneath laughter and iron discipline, they didn't vanish when a person learned to be honest, they stayed, they accumulated. And at some point, the body spoke in a way that couldn't be ignored. The news of cancer arrived without drama, without noise, but enough to slow everything down in painful ways. For Terry, it wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was a reminder that the lifelong escape had finally reached its limit. The surgeries came one after another, carrying a fragility he'd never gotten used to. On the operating table, Terry was no longer a quarterback, no longer the one controlling the pace of the game, no longer the one making split-second decisions. He became a body that needed care, needed protection, needed time to recover. The physical decline didn't come suddenly like a hit, it came slowly, bit by bit, forcing him to accept what he'd fought against his whole life: limits. There were mornings Terry woke up and realized his body no longer responded to commands like before. There were days of unexplained fatigue, dull pains reminding him that time was no longer an ally. In that phase, Terry began to deeply understand something he'd only known intellectually before. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't use discipline to overcome everything. He couldn't use laughter to cover every crack. He couldn't use titles or the past to negotiate with his body. Cancer doesn't care who you are, how many games you won, how high you once stood. It forces a person to stop, to listen, to face finitude in the most direct way. For Terry, that was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it stripped away the last illusion of control. Liberating because for the first time, he no longer had to strain to prove anything. The physical weakening made Terry look back at his life with a different rhythm. He began to realize he'd lived too long in a state of tension, as if there was always another game waiting ahead. His body carried the marks of every phase, old injuries, lingering pains, and now an illness that couldn't be ignored. The body remembers everything. The body remembers it all. It remembers what the mind tried to forget, remembers the times it was forced to be strong when inside it was breaking. Terry no longer denied that. He didn't see the illness as an enemy to defeat with willpower. He saw it as a belated message, forcing him to slow down and be more honest with himself. The days of recovery after surgery brought a different kind of silence. Not the silence of shame or hiding, but the silence of acceptance. Terry spent more time alone, not to escape, but to listen. He began to understand that strength no longer lay in endless endurance, but in the ability to recognize when it was time to stop. For someone who had once tied his self-worth to performance and victory, this was a painful but necessary shift. Terry no longer measured days by achievements, but by the mornings his body allowed him to step outside, by the quiet moments uninterrupted by anxiety. Illness didn't bring miraculous healing, it didn't erase the depression, didn't make the heavy memories disappear, but it changed Terry's relationship with himself. He no longer saw weakness as moral failure, he no longer viewed needing help as something shameful, and most importantly, he no longer believed he could keep running from everything that had built up over a lifetime. His body had forced him to stay, to face it, to live in reality instead of always looking toward the next game. In this phase, Terry Bradshaw understood that the greatest battle wasn't against illness, but learning to live with finitude. No more youthful illusions of immortality, no more feeling that he could overcome anything just with willpower. Just a man who had gone very far, endured so much, and now had to learn to be gentler with himself. When his body spoke, Terry no longer ran, he listened. And in that listening, he began to accept that his journey was no longer about proving strength, but about finding a way to exist more honestly, more slowly, more human, even if that meant admitting he couldn't run anymore. After the illness, after the surgeries and the unavoidable acknowledgement of his own limits, Terry Bradshaw stepped into another space in life, one without noise, without demands, and without an audience. When the cheers had faded away, when the stage lights had gone out completely, the ones who remained weren't titles or memories of victory, they were family. Terry's children, the people who had seen him through so many different versions of himself, didn't need him to be a hero. They didn't measure love by achievements, didn't weigh his presence by whether he was still useful. In that seemingly simple normalcy, Terry felt for the first time a kind of safety he had rarely touched in his life, being allowed to stay without having to prove anything. Terry's life in this phase was so private, it almost completely reversed the public image people once knew. No more packed schedules, no more constant appearances, no more laughter that had to come on cue, slow mornings, family meals, conversations without a clear purpose became the new rhythm. Terry no longer had to play the strong role. He could be tired without shame, could be silent without it being mistaken for failure. Family didn't demand that he lead, that he win, or that he be first. They just needed him to be there. And that unconditional presence created a late but solid anchor. In these relationships, Terry began to learn a lesson football never taught, that a person's worth doesn't lie in infinite endurance. With his children, he didn't need to set an example through toughness, he could set one through honesty. He could say he had once been afraid, once been lost, once didn't know how to love, and surprisingly that truth didn't make him smaller in their eyes, it made him closer. Conversations no longer revolved around achievements or a glorious past, they revolved around the present, where Terry was learning to live slowly, to listen, and to accept that he didn't need to be perfect to be loved. Family was also where Terry realized the difference between the silence of hiding and the silence of peace. Before, silence had always been tied to fear of being discovered, to the pressure of maintaining an image. Now silence could be a quiet afternoon, where no one asked what he had to do next, where no one waited for him to win again. That quiet wasn't threatening, it healed in a gentle way. Terry began to feel that life wasn't just a series of challenges to overcome, it was also moments allowed to pause without judgment. Relationships that didn't demand he be strong also forced Terry to re-examine the old definition of masculinity he'd carried his whole life. He had once believed strength meant showing no cracks, never asking for help, never backing down. But in family, strength took a different shape, daring to admit fatigue, daring to say he needed time, daring to be present without answers for everything. Terry was no longer the one leading with shouts in the huddle, he was the one sitting and listening, learning to stay with emotions without needing to fix them right away. It didn't come easily, but it came real. For the first time in his life, Terry Bradshaw felt he didn't need to win to be allowed to stay, didn't need a stellar performance to be loved, didn't need to outdo someone to prove his worth. Family became a late anchor, not loud, not showy, but strong enough for him to lean on when both body and mind had been through too much. Here he wasn't an NFL legend, wasn't the jokester on television, wasn't the symbol of a dynasty. He was just a father, a member of a small circle where presence mattered more than any title. This anchor didn't erase the painful years before, it didn't rewrite the past, didn't turn wounds into fond memories, but it gave Terry a different present, a present where he could breathe without fear of judgment, where he could stay without having to strain. And in that simplicity, Terry began to understand that some victories don't need an audience, don't need silver trophies, don't need history to record the name. They happen in quiet rooms, among people who accept you as you are. When the noise had gone, family was what remained. And for Terry Bradshaw, that was the first time he truly felt he had a place to come home to. After finding that late anchor in family, Terry Bradshaw didn't step into a phase of being healed the way inspirational stories often promise. There was no blinding moment of light, no day he woke up and realized all the heaviness had vanished. Depression didn't leave, anxiety didn't dissolve. The old memories, the defensive reflexes formed from adolescence, they were still there, sometimes rising without warning. The only difference was that Terry no longer tried to erase them from his life. He stopped fighting himself, as if in an endless game, and began learning to live alongside what couldn't be fully fixed. That wasn't surrender. It was a bitter, mature, and far harder acceptance than continuing to pretend to be strong. In this phase, Terry understood that the idea of complete healing could be a dangerous illusion for people who had lived too long under tension. He wasn't looking for a newer, more perfect version of himself. He was only looking for a way to exist without being controlled by old fears. The double life, the two parallel selves that once helped him survive, didn't disappear. The public hero still existed, the laughter still came when needed. The inner man, with his heavy and tired days, was still there too, but the boundary between them was no longer as sharp as before. Terry no longer let those two people confront each other. He allowed them to coexist, in a silent but honest agreement, no denial, no exaggeration, no using one to smother the other. Living with depression required Terry to learn a new rhythm of life. Some days he felt okay, some days he didn't. Instead of self-blame, he learned to notice. Instead of running, he learned to pause. He understood that some emotions didn't need immediate fixing, just acknowledgement. This went against the entire value system he'd grown up with, where problems had to be solved, where weakness had to be eliminated. But that small change made a big difference. Terry no longer panicked when the dark days returned. He knew they would come, and then they would go, like the tide. They didn't define his entire self, and no longer had the right to control every decision. This acceptance carried bitterness because it came with no promise of a happy ending. Terry couldn't say everything was fine. He could only say he had learned to stay. Stay with a body that had weakened. Stay with a mind that wasn't completely quiet. Stay with limits he once saw as enemies. That required a different kind of courage, far quieter than stepping onto the field for a Super Bowl. Courage not to run. Courage not to paint over. Courage to accept that some wounds never fully close, but no longer need to be hidden. The double life, once a life or death burden, gradually became something manageable. Terry no longer let it drive every reaction. He knew when to withdraw, when to rest, when to say no, a word he had rarely allowed himself before. He no longer saw self-care as a sign of weakness. He saw it as responsibility, responsibility to the people who stayed when the noise left, and responsibility to himself, the man who had lived through too many years of tension to keep punishing himself. In this phase of life, Terry Bradshaw no longer sought forgiveness from the past or validation from the outside. He didn't need history rewritten in a gentler way. She just needed a present he could bear. Peace, if it came, didn't arrive as euphoric feeling. It arrived as enough space to breathe. In that space, Terry allowed himself to be imperfect, unstable, uncertain, things he once believed were unacceptable for a man like him. Making peace without healing means accepting that this journey has no clear finish line. There's no final victory day over depression. There's no celebration ceremony for being okay. There are only the continuation of ordinary days, where Terry learns to live more gently with himself. He is no longer controlled by the double life, but he doesn't deny it either. He lives alongside it, more awake, more human. And in that bitter acceptance, Terry Bradshaw finds a late kind of freedom. Freedom isn't the absence of pain, but no longer letting pain decide who he is. In old age, Terry Bradshaw no longer stands in the places the spotlight seeks first. He doesn't step onto the field to roaring crowds, doesn't stand in the studio with the task of making everyone laugh. His life has slowed down in a way he never allowed himself to experience for decades. Mornings without packed schedules, afternoons drifting in silence, stretches of time not chopped up by other people's expectations. Terry no longer chases the lights, because he lived under them too long and understood the price that light demands. He doesn't need to prove anything anymore, because all the effort to prove took away too many years, too much energy, too much peace he could never fully reclaim. In this phase, Terry looks back at his life, not with loud pride, nor with melodramatic regret. He looks with late understanding. He understands that the victories didn't save him, but they weren't meaningless either. They just weren't the answer to the deepest questions he carried from childhood. Terry once believed that if he won enough, the fear would disappear. But the fear didn't disappear, it only changed shape. And when he stopped running from it, stopped trying to defeat it, he learned a bitter but true lesson: some battles can't be won, only endured. Old age came to Terry not as a reward for a great life, but as a gentle yet unrelenting reminder of finitude. The body is no longer strong, the mind isn't completely quiet, and memories still return from time to time, carrying the heaviness of years gone by. But unlike before, Terry doesn't rush to chase them away. He allows memories to exist, allows fatigue to speak, allows himself to weaken without self-blame. That is a new kind of courage, quiet, without an audience. Courage to keep living without hiding, without painting over, without trying to turn life into a neat inspirational story. Terry Bradshaw paid enough for his greatness. That price wasn't just in the injuries, the surgeries, or the years his body was worn down. That price was in the sleepless nights, the prolonged periods of depression, the broken relationships, because he didn't know how to love while he was still breaking apart. That price was in living two parallel lives for decades, always afraid that if the truth came out, everything he'd built would collapse. No trophy records that price, no Hall of Fame mentions it. But it exists, etched deep into every decision, every silence, every time he chose to keep living even when he wasn't sure where he was going anymore. At the end of the journey, Terry doesn't seek peace as a victory. He doesn't declare that he's okay. He only accepts that he's still here, still breathing, still present, still learning to live alongside what can't be erased. Peace, if it exists, doesn't come as absolute stillness, but as the ability to endure without collapsing. He didn't conquer the anxiety. He learned to keep it from controlling him. He didn't defeat depression. He lives beside it with more awareness and more humanity. That isn't the story people usually want to hear, but it's the truth of so many lives, and it's the truth of Terry Bradshaw. When he no longer needs to prove anything, Terry begins to appreciate the small things once overlooked: conversations without purpose, quiet moments that don't need to be filled, days that pass without preparing for any game. He understands that his worth no longer lies in how he'll be remembered, but in how he lives the rest of his life, not rushing, not pretending, not punishing himself for what couldn't have been different. Terry doesn't try to rewrite the past, doesn't seek to justify the mistakes, he only allows them to exist as part of who he is. This epilogue doesn't bring complete comfort. It doesn't close the story with a bright note. It ends with a heavy but fair truth. Some people don't find peace as a reward, they have to endure to keep it at a livable level. Terry Bradshaw isn't the man who won everything. He is the man who survived himself, survived harsh value systems, survived unrelenting expectations, survived the fear of exposure he carried his whole life, and perhaps that is the legacy least mentioned, but most worthy of respect. Not what he conquered on the field, but what he endured when no one was watching. Not the victories recorded in history, but the ordinary days he still stood through, even when his strength was no longer what it used to be, because in the end some people are honored for what they conquered, and there are also people like Terry Bradshaw, who should be respected for what they survived. The story of Terry Bradshaw leaves a deep and very real sadness, not because he failed, but because of the enormous price he had to pay to become the icon America celebrated. 4 Super Bowls, the label of legend, endless roaring crowds, all of that seemed like the destination, but in this story, they appear as a shell hiding a life eroded from the inside. Right from his harsh Southern childhood in the United States, Terry was taught that weakness equaled failure, that very men don't get to be weak. Culture planted the seed of fear of being seen as inadequate, sending him into the NFL, not with confidence, but with an obsession to prove his worth every day. Those early seasons in Pittsburgh, when the press called him the draft disaster, and even the home fans booed him, showed a heartbreaking truth. Society can cheer very quickly, but it can also turn its back just as cruelly. Terry learned to endure humiliation in silence, then kept straining in the cold locker room, where there wasn't a single word of encouragement from coach Chuck Noll, even when he won 4 Super Bowls and became MVP. Depression, insomnia, and anxiety still quietly took root, a detail showing that victory didn't protect a person from psychological wounds. The biggest lesson this story sends to the American people is success should not be the only measure of a person's worth. Terry Bradshaw lived 2 lives for 30 years because he feared being seen as weak. Only when he dared to go public with his depression, dared to admit the medication, dared to slow down with family and accept illness, did he find a fragile kind of peace. His story reminds us that real strength doesn't lie in never falling, but in the ability to survive, face it, and keep existing humanly in a society that always demands we be strong. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey full of silence and endurance. If the real stories behind the glory touched you, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us. See you in the next video, where we'll continue listening to lives that seem brilliant, but had to pay a very high price to survive.